Drogi, and this is my search for a material soul. I'm finally talking about free will. I think the materialism part is going to be easy, but I'm not sure how the spirituality part is going to go. I've been thinking about the problem of free will since I was an undergraduate. I swear I did all of my undergraduate essays on free will and determinism. The problem is set up in philosophy as a logical incompatibility. The way free will is defined as something that has no cause, that is, you could have done otherwise. You could have chosen to do this thing, or you could have chosen to do this thing at the moment of decision. So there's no determination of that free choice. So you're always completely free to be able to choose. And determinism is the idea that the choice is determined, that there are causes that generated your decision at the moment of decision. You could not have done otherwise. At the moment of decision, everything was set up such that that would be the thing that you had to choose. And so if those are the ways that we define free will and determinism, then there's no way around it. You can't have both of them. You have to be an incompatibilist in one way or another. Either you redefine free will so that it could be compatible with determinism, or you have to just accept that one or the other is the case, that either free will is able to somehow get into an otherwise determined physical causal structure, or you have to just give up free will and accept that everything is determined. Determinism is usually characterized in terms of physical causal law. The idea is that the laws of physics determine that everything has to happen according to a set process. So you've got the Newtonian laws that seem unexceptioned, rate and acceleration, none of which I really understand. I did very badly in physics. So you have the idea that from the very Big Bang, when the world exploded, the laws of physics were established, and then everything that has physically happened since the Big Bang has been determined to be the case, and everything that will be the case is physically determined according to these laws of physics. They're absolutely unexceptioned. They determine absolutely every movement of every particle in the universe, and so there could be no possible free will because physical causal law determines that every action is set. And so it's very difficult then for free will to insert itself into this determined causal world. So this is one of the main reasons that Descartes had for dualism. And his idea was that the mind was separate. It was different. It wasn't part of the causal order, and so it wasn't determined by physical causal processes. So you had a mechanistic universe that was governed by Newton's laws, but then the mind could think all kinds of things on its own and could do all kinds of things on its own, and that would be fine because it was entirely separate from physical causal law. Except that the problem is how to get this non-physical mind to be influenced by the world. When you see things out in the world, it seems like they appear in your mind, and then your mind thinks about things and causes your body to do things. And so that's the really sticky bit, is how could a non-physical mind have any sort of effect on the physical world, and also how could the physical world have an effect on the mind, although that's somewhat less problematic because of the idea of physical causal closure, which is the idea that you can't add or subtract energy from a physically closed system. And so there's some debate about whether our universe is physically causally closed, but it does seem that all of the processes of an action, say the action that I have of moving my hands and speaking right now, all of those are accounted for energistically, that there is energy in the world that fuels my body and that gives me stimulation, and then that causes my brain to work, and we can trace with our fMRI machines what's going on in my brain, and then we can see how the different brain things are moving about, and they cause me to have the speech. That is the conversation that I'm having now. That all seems like it's physically produced, and there doesn't seem to be any room in that physical story for a non-physical mind to intervene and get somehow my thoughts, which are non-physical, to be operating simultaneously, or to be causing my neurons to be doing the things that my neurons are doing. And it's at the neuronal level that the most excitement about free will has happened in the last several years, that neuroscientists have been looking at the neural system and trying to clock what's going on with your neurons when you do decision making. And so there was a very exciting experiment by Benjamin Libet, and he discovered that when he asked people to move their wrist, he could clock when the motor cortex initiated the wrist movement, and he could clock when the person felt like they decided to move their wrist. And it turned out that the motor cortex initiated the action before the person felt like they decided to act. And so the neuroscientists then said, well, the conclusion is that we don't have free will, that the motor cortex, the brain, is doing all of the initiating of action, and so your experience of moving your wrist or making a decision about something just happens too late for us to have free will. And so here's a part where materialism can be helpful, because the problem seems to be in the conscious experience happening after the brain initiates an action. And so it feels then like, well, the conscious experience is me, that's my mind, that's my free will, is my conscious experience of willing. And if my brain is deciding things before I have that conscious experience, then it can't be my free choice. But if I am my brain, if consciousness is not my soul, as we saw in the earlier episode from season 1, my consciousness is doing different work than myself. Myself is much bigger than just this conscious experience that I'm having at this moment. This experience is important to who I am, but it's not the whole me. That is the me that is free or not free, and deciding or not deciding. That who it is to be me is a much larger package, and that package is packaged in this brain and body. And so all of it, including my motor cortex, count as the person that I am, that is free to do or not do whatever it is that I choose. So here we need to ask then, what is it for me to make a free choice? And the first requirement, obviously, is that I'm not compelled. I'm not forced into something. If somebody's holding a gun to my head, or somebody pushes me and I fall into somebody else, these are actions that I'm doing that are compelled by someone else. Either I'm coerced by someone who's holding the gun to my head to give all my money away, or somebody physically pushes me and that physically causes me to push somebody else. I am not free in those cases to do what it is that I choose to do, because outside factors are requiring that I do a certain action. I don't have any options in those kinds of cases. Now, you might say that in the case where I'm coerced, there is some amount of free will. You can always refuse, even if the consequence is that you are going to die, and that gets into sort of morally murky territory that I'm not going to cover. But the idea is that if those clear external factors are not involved, then we have a much better argument for saying that my choice is free. I'm not externally coerced or influenced in making a decision that I'm making. So then the second factor that's important, first is that you need to have options. You're not compelled to do one thing or another. And then, those options also have to be available. There has to be more than one possibility. So not just that I'm not externally coerced, but that there are two possibilities of things that I could do. If there's only one thing that's open to me and no other options, then I have to do that one thing. And so it's a different sort of external constraint, that there are just simply no options available. And the second factor, I think, is probably the most important, is that I reflect on what my action is, that I think about what action that I want to do in this sort of case. Now, it doesn't have to be that I do this reflective step before I do any action, because oftentimes in an important instance where something's going on, I need to make a quick decision and I can't sit and reflect at the moment. What am I going to do in this kind of a case? You just need to react very quickly. But I think, again, when we think about what it is to be me and what it is to decide for myself, to be free in making my own decisions, it is a longer temporal process that goes into making me the self that I am. I talked earlier about virtue ethics and the way in which we set up habits for ourselves to become good people. And I think it is a matter of free will to determine what sort of character we will have, to set up, to think about what kind of person I want to be, and to set up structures for myself so that I develop the sort of character that will act in a situation according to the sort of ways that I think are good ways to act. And if I act badly, if I'm reflecting on an action that I did yesterday, for example, and I think, I really don't like how that action turned out, then that's a self-reflective moment to set up new habits so I don't do that sort of thing again. These are the ways in which I think free will isn't a matter of, at this moment, I'm making a decision to do something, and that moment has to be a moment where I'm free to do otherwise. I think that free will has a longer time frame so that over time, I have the option to make myself into the kind of person that I'd like to be. And self-reflection is a key component to that process, that long-term process of making myself the kind of self that I want to be. The third component in free will, I think, is giving reasons, to have some kind of reason in the process of reflection for choosing one way to be as opposed to another way to be. That you have reflected on how you think about the world as and your place within the world, and you've got reasons like like I want to be a loving person. I think it's good to love people and to be kind to people, or that I want to be a fit person and I want to exercise regularly, and so I want to make the decision to exercise, and so I think that being healthy is a good way to be, and so I'm going to set up a life for myself so that I'm healthy, or whatever kinds of things you decide are important to being the kind of person that you want to be. You have reasons for being that kind of person, even if that's not a pleasant thing. It's something that I might think of as immoral, like I want to be the richest person in the world, and I think that it's the kind of person I want to be is a rich person, because rich people have all the power and they can do whatever they want, and that's the kind of person that I want to be. I don't particularly think that that's a valuable choice to make, but that is nonetheless a free choice that a person could make. They have reasons for doing it and have reflected on those reasons, and they have the option to become a rich person, and so that would be a free choice according to these criteria. And the fourth thing that I think is important for free will is that all of your reasons and your choices are authentic to yourself. And this is where it really gets difficult because you're making choices to be a particular kind of person, but you're also making those choices in relation to the kind of person that you are. And so it's sort of an ongoing dynamic process of creating yourself out of a self that you are. And this raises an interesting question about change and to what extent change is possible. And I don't have the answer to that. That's something that I've been thinking about and may come back to in a later podcast. Because, on the one hand, we say, oh, nobody changes. You should never try to change another person. You certainly should never try to change another person. But we also say that, like we could change. I could become a better person. And that idea that I could become a better person or a different person, that I don't like who I was in the past and I could be somebody different in the future, that's also rooted in this idea of free will, of choosing who I'm going to be. And it does seem like that's possible for me. It seems like people do that. And so the question is, how does that work in relation to this idea of free will, and in relation to the idea of rooting your reasons in who you are, in your self, and who you want to be. And one of the ways to think about that might be in relation to who you've been in the past and who you want to be in the future. And it can still be yourself if you recognize that you were a certain way and you yourself want to change that into a new way of being, and you're hopefully then successful in that process. So thinking about free will, again, longer temporal process, not just I'm free to do this at this moment. And that's one of the reasons that it's difficult to blame people who make an impulsive decision and maybe have terrible regrets about that impulsive decision, unless that decision is something that is chosen over a long period of time. Then we ought to be more forgiving of a person who makes an impulsive decision in a moment that doesn't reflect who they are over a longer period of time. It doesn't mean that they shouldn't be held to account if somebody impulsively kills another person, that other person is still dead or harmed in some way. But this is the question in terms of thinking about praise and blame that attaches to free will. If a person is not free to choose, if they don't have free will, if everything is determined, then it seems hard to blame them for the things that they've done, because it was determined since the Big Bang that they were going to do these things, so how are we going to blame them? And so determinism creates a very puzzling sort of situation for us individually and socially in terms of holding people culpable for the bad things that they do, or in praising people for the good things that they do. So having some sense of free will is important, but having a longer sense of what determines a decision, so that it's not a question of I've consciously decided at this moment, and therefore that is the expanse of a free choice. No, it's a much longer process that goes into determining who you're going to be and what options you have based on self-reflection and reasons. We need to, I should say one more word about the determinism part, that if physical causal processes are determined from the Big Bang, then we aren't morally responsible. But it doesn't look like physical causal processes are determined from the Big Bang. It seems like there are all kinds of examples of variability, evolution, and biology all seem to introduce weirdnesses, mutations, and adaptations that do not seem necessarily to have been determined from the Big Bang. It's not clear, for example, that we can reduce biological laws, biological processes, to physical laws. And it doesn't seem like we have to. There are quantum processes that create quantum indeterminacy. And so even though Newton's laws are very useful and we need to use them when we build buildings and airplanes and the rest, it doesn't look like we're committed to every single physical causal process being unexceptioned and necessarily determined from the previous processes. Things operate according to probabilities rather than necessities. And when you have the wiggle room of statistical probability, then you can say with some good certainty that if you drop something, it will fall, but much less certainty that a particular plant will grow in a particular sort of way, or that these plants will adapt in these sorts of ways to climate change. We just don't know how weather will happen. We just don't know with absolute certainty because the processes are statistical and not absolutely rigidly determined. And arguably, our brains are in the same situation in terms of there being regular causal processes and probabilities that are more or less exceptioned, that we can expect certain regularities in dealing with one another's brains and when dealing with our own brains, but there is room for change over the course of time based on the weight of events and on how the causal interactions in your brain operate in relation to one another. So there's room for reason to organize your brain systems in various ways and for the world to affect those brain systems and for those brain systems to affect the world in a dynamic process that allows change over the course of a lifetime. So we've got a sense that materially, physically, the brain can change over the course of time in such a way that you can choose more or less what kind of person that you want to be. There are structural limits and limits to your capacities to think as well as your physical capacities, which obviously for a materialist are connected, but there is room for change and room for free will in that materialist story. Now, for the spiritual story, how do we think about free will? On the one hand, it seems like, well, the spirit is either non-physical or something like that, and so no rules ought to apply to your spiritual choices and so forth. On the other hand, there's a long tradition in many spiritual, especially monotheistic traditions, that God has a plan, God's in control, God determines everything that happens in the world. And if determinism from a theological perspective is true, then we have the same problems about free will that we had with physical causal determinism. And so this raises the theological question of free will in relation to God. Does God determine everything, or did God give humans the capacity to make our own choices? You might guess already that my view is that we do have the capacity to make choices, that God hasn't absolutely determined every action that happens in the world, that that people get to make their decisions. And indeed, I think that the physical causal world is its own thing, that God may be the creator, but the creation, once created, is navigating its own physical processes in its own way over the course of time. So there are various consequences theologically to this particular view. One is you have to give up omniscience of God. So it's often claimed, and it's not part of the Bible, as far as I know, that God is all-knowing, that God knows everything that has ever happened and everything that will happen. That's one of the things that philosophers have added in terms of thinking about the nature of God. Oh, well, God must be omniscient in order to, I don't know, be really God. That our vision of what it is to be God is to be all powerful and all knowing and all loving and all the alls. Like it wouldn't be God. One of the arguments that has been used is that God wouldn't be God if God didn't have all of the best attributes. If God were deficient in some way, then God couldn't be God. And I don't consider a lack of omniscience a kind of deficiency, but, philosophically, maybe that's a reason not to accept this view. One of the important parts of this journey is for me to try to figure out what a kind of spirituality would be that would be compatible with materialism. So that's a kind of constraint on my journey that you need to decide for yourself whether you're going to follow me on that component. Is that something that you're willing to give up? The idea of the all God, of the omni God, and accept that God also lives in time with us, that we are all living in the present moment, and we are all considering how to act in a way that is true to ourselves at this moment. And that I think is a key component of spirituality, to be in the present and to be acting in such a way to bring about a future that is a future that could be heaven. And this is something we can think about at a later podcast, thinking about what heaven is and what happens after death, and whether that's heaven, or whether heaven, the kingdom of God, as it's often called in Christianity, the kingdom of God is a future state in which everyone lives in harmony, as opposed to in strife, as opposed to living in strife with one another. So the end result is we have free will. That's good news. We have to give up some elements. It always happens in philosophy that, philosophical problems are problems because there are alternatives that are equally compelling. So in choosing free will, in thinking free will is the case, we need to give up the idea of free will as freedom to do otherwise at the moment of decision. We need to accept a view of free will that's a longer temporal sort of developmental process rather than an instantaneous process. And we need to give up the idea of physical causal determinism, so we can accept physical causation as being an important determination of our actions, particularly our physical causes in our brains, but we give up determinism from the Big Bang as absolutely establishing everything going forward. Similarly, in the spiritual realm, we can give up the omni-God and give up theological determinism, the determinism of God to establish every single thing that happens. And in consequence, we have a sense of ourselves as free in this moment to develop ourselves into the best person that we can be, to follow whatever spiritual guide we have towards developing ourselves and our spirituality towards thinking of a better life for ourselves and our world. Now, there's one element of the determination of God of the world that people often find difficult to give up, and is a puzzling question. It's the question of God's plan. Does God have a plan? This is one of the virtues of the idea of thinking of God as determining everything, because then we can think that even these horrible things that are going on are part of God's plan, and maybe they're not as horrible as they seem. There's this idea of the best of all possible worlds was argued, that God could have chosen any kind of system. So why did God choose a system where there is so much evil in the world and natural disasters and all these horrible things. Couldn't have God have made a nicer world? And one of the responses to that is to say, well, all of the bad things have some greater good, that, we go through these trials and we become better people and develop character, and it unifies us and so forth and so on, or it's a test of our moral abilities and capacities. So these are all different ways to make to make an excuse for the fact that there's a lot of crappy stuff that goes on, and God seems to let all this crappy stuff go on. If God is all powerful, God could stop all these awful things from happening, or not cause all these awful things to happen, and God doesn't. And so either God is bad, which seems to contradict the idea of a loving God, or that this is the best of all possible worlds, that God figured it out such that this is, we have to have all the bad things in order to have the good things. So that's one way to go. Another way to go is that, the bad things just happen. There are bad things that happen. That's just part of how things go. And also, people who are given free will cause bad things to happen. And that's also something that is part of how things are in the material world, that people choose, and people choose badly, and so there are bad consequences of people choosing badly. And so one of the roles of spirituality is to try to guide ourselves and others to not being bad people and not choosing bad things, and again, to make the world a better world, to move towards a space where we're kind to one another instead of causing one another harm. And so, so is that God's plan? Is God doing anything? Does God interfere in the natural order in order to kind of tweak us one way or another towards a better world, towards being better people? And I think that this is an open question that we can think more about, is what, given the scenario that I've set up so far, what way could we have of thinking about God's role in the world such that it's not absolutely determining everything that goes on, but also not just clockmaker God, that God created the world, set it winding, and everything else is just, just how we and natural causal processes turn out to be. And God's kind of hands off and watching how it all turns out. And that doesn't seem to be a picture that's very satisfying either. So I'm going to save this question for a later podcast. What could be God's role in the world? My sense is that it has something to do with revelation. When we think about various different scriptures and prophets as revealing God's will, a way to think about that is as a way that God is intervening to provide us with guidance on how to be better people, on how to make the world a better place. And so we can think of scriptures as guides in that sort of way. And other ways in which we can look at the world and find guidance. This may be a way of thinking about how God works in the world, and might get us closer to this question of what a material view of spirituality would look like. So I hope you continue on with my journey.